Who needs Forbes 30 under 30 when we have Wizards of the Coast's 10 under 100 celebration? In this video, I'll be covering 10 instants that are included in less than 100 decks on EDHREC. Our first card today is Backdraft, a 2-mana instant that is played in 96 decks. This card says, Backdraft does half of the damage rounded down done by one sorcery cast this turn to the caster of the sorcery. So, if you're reading this, you likely know exactly what use case I'm talking about. One-shot the person who cast the most played board wipe in the game and the 13th most popular non-land card in the entire game, Blasphemous Act. For context, Blasphemous Act is played in more decks than Rampant Growth, Nature's Lore, and Chaos Warp. If someone casts Blasphemous Act, there needs to be a minimum of 7 creatures on the board for Backdraft to deal over 40 damage. At that rate, the person would still be paying 2 mana, so if you ever see anyone that can play the fully discounted Blasphemous Act, which we've all seen before, then this spell can kill. This also works against other popular spells like Crackle with Power, Star of Extinction, Chain Reaction, Mizium Mortars, Volcanic Torrent, or Call Forth the Tempest. So pretty much, if you're going against a red deck, this is a card that you could play in your deck and likely cast this because there are very popular options that slot into the red decks as a board wipe. Next up is Shriek of Dread, which is played in 95 decks. Shriek of Dread is a 2-mana instant that says target creature can't be blocked this turn except by artifact creatures and or black creatures. Essentially, this card gives a creature of yours fear, which does the exact same thing. It can't be blocked except by artifact creatures and or black creatures. This is an incredibly useful card to connect with opponents for abilities that require you to deal combat damage for an opponent. Use this to connect with the infamous Cruel Claw to cast something nasty for free. Maybe Obeka Splitter of Seconds to get a bunch of additional upkeeps, Ancient Brass Dragon for some crazy reanimation, or Unstoppable Slasher to make them lose half their life. This is a pretty simple card, but the ability isn't some obscure or terrible effect that could only be played in 95 out of 5.3 million decks. So there is a use case. If this sounds interesting to you, give it a shot. Our third card today is Mudhole, which sees play in 81 total decks. Mudhole is a 3-mana instant that says, target player removes all land cards in his or her graveyard from the game. I know, this is overshadowed by all the graveyard hate cards in the game, and it is a very narrow use case because it targets the deck that wants to bring back lands from their graveyard. However, if you do play against those decks frequently, I do think that this has something going for it that could be a good option for you. And that is, this card is an instant, so it will always be a surprise to the lands player and can be cast in response to the ability. So if you're in mono red, you are pretty, limited to mostly just artifact graveyard hate. But the issue with those artifact graveyard hate cards is that they need to be on the board in order to activate the ability. So a player could play around your artifact because they see it on the board, or they remove it before they play their big hurrah spell. The fact that this is hidden in your hand and comes from a color that doesn't typically exile graveyards means that you're likely able to limit the Gitrog player, or maybe the Necrobloom player using cards like Lumra Bellow of the Woods or Aftermath Analyst. If you are a mono red player or need instant speed lands in graveyard hate to counter a friend or that one person at your LGS, then this is one of the most unpopular answers you can find. And trust me, I did my research on that. Number 4 today is Serene Heart with 77 decks. Serene Heart costs 1 and a green and says, destroy all local enchantments. For anyone who is not familiar with the term local enchantments, this is MTG's old term for auras. So with that being said, this is a 2-mana instant that says, destroy all aura enchantments. This is great answer against Voltron decks, Light Paws, Ariette of the Charmed Apple, Uriel the Miststalker, who is already difficult to handle due to the built-in hexproof, and something like Bruna Light of Alabaster. If you're tired of losing to friends who play these kind of decks, or it is heavy in your LGS meta, then pull this card out and tell all the new players that you did indeed destroy all their auras. And if anyone was watching this video playing back in the days when auras were called local enchantments, please let me know, because I'd love to know how long people have been playing, and if so, like, when did you start? I'll pin the comment for the person in the comments below who had the lowest DCI number, so let me know. In 5th place is a tie with Serene Heart at 77 decks as well, and this is Great Defender. Great Defender is a 1-mana instant that says target creature gains +0/+X until end of turn, where X is the creature's casting cost. This could slot well into a defender-focused deck that deals damage based on toughness, like Arcades the Strategist, Doran the Siege Tower, or one of my decks that gained so much life was EDHREC the Usurper, partnered with Prava of the Still Legion. EDHREC gives you life equal to a creature's toughness that deals combat damage, and Prava gives your creature tokens +1/+4. So basically, a 1/1 gives you 5 life when it attacks. Granted, this card won't do anything on a token, but if you're planning, on swinging with creatures with big butts in that deck that aren't tokens, this works well. I'm actually going to skip ahead to a very similar card on this list and just count this as a bonus. We're not counting this as some of the 10 cards. It is Subdue, and Subdue sees play in 48 total decks. It is a mono green card as opposed to white, and says target creature deals no damage during combat but gains X toughness until end of turn. X is target creature's casting cost. So Subdue is much more limiting, I'd say, than Great Defender, because your creature can't deal damage this turn. So how could you even use this? Well, I'm glad I asked myself. You could use this on Anzrage the Quake Mole. You can play Anzrag's ability to force it to be blocked, but Anzrag deals no damage when it is blocked. So you get as many combats as you need to finish people off with other creatures. Because, normally Anzrag being forced to be blocked just kills off your opponent's creatures, but since it deals no damage, they're kind of locked into this infinite loop until you finish them off with other creatures and whittle them down in other ways. Partner that with another card mentioned in my previous video, Nexus of Becoming, to draw a card on each new combat phase and create a new creature or artifact token on this myriad of new extra combats, I should say. This could also be used in an Arwen Weaver of Hope deck. Maybe tap down a Llanowar Elf to make Arwen a 2/4. Now every creature you control enters the battlefield with 3 +1/+1 counters on it. These may be pretty narrow use cases, but I'm sharing them because there are more ways that I think can be used in over 48 decks. So that's a really low use case, but there are a lot of things that you can do. If you're enjoying these cards and videos, I'll share more sub 100 cards that didn't make the cut for the video in the Discord channel. The Unpopular MTG Club Patreon is only $2, and we talk all things unpopular cards. Share ideas for deck lists, what we're building, what we're getting ready for, and we're also trying to set up some spell table games featuring unpopular commanders under 1,000 decks. So the link is in the description below if that's something that sounds interesting to you. At number 6 is Fulgent Distraction, which is played in 75 decks. This is a 2 mana and a white instant that says choose 2 target creatures. Tap those creatures, then unattach all equipment from them. One downside to this card is that it doesn't say up to 2 target creatures. So, you do need to have 2 targets for the spell to cast it. If both creatures became illegal targets, then the spell wouldn't resolve. But the rules say that if one becomes an illegal target, it won't be affected, but the other chosen creature will be affected. Assuming this spell does resolve, the floor is that you tap 2 creatures, either, to prevent blockers or attackers, but the ceiling is removing those blockers or attackers and some high value equipment. Not every deck that runs equipment is Voltron. I will say this. I feel like whenever I highlight a card that removes equipment, people say it's useless because the creature will have hexproof. And yeah, I mean, if you are going against a dedicated Voltron deck, that makes sense because they usually do run hexproof. But one of the things that I will say is if you decide to slot in a card that sees play in 75 decks, you likely aren't planning to use this against the Voltron commander. This is to remove other high-value equipment that see play in everyday decks. After Swiftfoot Boots, Lightning Greaves, and Skull Clamp, the most played equipment cards are Sword of the Animist in 4th place with 240,000 decks, Mithril Coat in 5th place with 228,000 decks, Blackblade Reforged is in 6th place with 213,000 decks, Whisper Silk Cloak is in 7th place with 204,000 decks, Basilisk Collar is in 8th place with 193 decks, Shadow Spear in 9th with 186,000, and Helm of the Host is in 10th place with 170,000 decks. So if any given one of the top 10 most played equipment cards are on the battlefield, there's a 70% chance that Fulgent Distraction would successfully remove the equipment from the creature. Even with a floor of tapping down 2 unequipped blockers to swing for a lot of damage, this isn't a terrible card, and it isn't as bad as I expected for how little play it sees. Our 7th card today is Windshear, which sees play in 64 decks. Windshear is a 3-mana instant that says all attacking creatures with flying get -2/-2 and lose flying until end of turn. I'll tell you what, this is probably the last thing that most dragon and flying decks would expect to see when they swing at you. There's the seldom chance of a fog, but in many cases, this can be even worse. This is like granting reach to every non-attacking creature on the board while dropping power and toughness of attacking creatures by -2, which isn't insignificant. I used to have an all-flying deck, and I always felt, so comfortable swinging in for damage against open opponents because all their big creatures didn't have flying or reach, so it was a free shot. I would have fallen for this trap all the time. Also, with the upcoming Tarkir Dragonstorm decks and set coming out, this might become even more relevant, and we'll likely see an influx of dragon-focused decks with the wild spoilers that we've already seen. I don't think most of these cards on the list today are on here because they're unplayable. I think they're just not broken enough to be remembered through, just the sands of time. The least played card from recent sets all see more play than any of these cards, like Ambulatory Edifice, which is played in 301 decks. Who even is playing that? There's also just so many cards that I'll cover today that I would slot in over that, but they'll never appear on EDHREC or online deck lists, which is where many people get their inspiration from, so these cards just can never make it out of the loop. Next up, we have Marsh Gas, which is in 63 decks. This is a single black mana that says all creatures get -2/-0 until end of turn. It's that simple, but I do think it's kind of unique because there's not many black cards that I can think of that only reduce power without also reducing toughness, thus, killing all of your tokens or weenie blockers. If there are some that I'm not thinking of, please let me know in the comments below. This card can be helpful to survive someone's all-out attacks because it doesn't kill any of your creatures, so yeah, you can no longer multi-block with a ton of tokens to kill their biggest threat, but if you're in a situation where someone is trying to end the game, you're probably trying to spread out your toughness across the biggest number of attackers rather than focusing all of your power against one single creature to kill it. So with that, the fact that this is a one single mana pip makes it more playable in certain situations and is why I included it on this list, as opposed to the majority, honestly, of do-nothing cards that fell into this sub-100 deck card category. Our second to last card today is Metal Fatigue, which sees play in just 46 decks. This is a 3-mana instant that says tap all artifacts. There isn't too much, to get into this here other than this can be very disruptive to your opponents, especially with the abundance of treasure tokens, mana rocks, and artifact tokens just in general that's running loose in the format. There's a few use cases that I could see myself casting this card for. The first of which is to force someone's hand on an end step before my turn begins. If someone tapped their lands but has several, let's say, treasure tokens open, they could be holding something up. So I cast this on an end step to pull out any instance before it's my turn, and I need to use up my mana to cast the response on my turn. So if they do have a card to play, I want them to have to sacrifice treasures in response to this card and cast the card there, then and there. If they do, I can then just untap all my lands and treasures on my turn, while all of my opponent's treasures and clue tokens are still tapped, giving me more flexibility to do work. This can also be cast at the beginning of combat before attackers are declared to tap down any attacking or blocking artifact creatures. What's actually super underrated about this that I think is many people choose to save their big plays for the post-combat main phase. By saving their big plays for post-combat, they can go into combat with cards in hand ready to respond to any opponent's spells, and this gives less information about their strategy. If they tap out all of that in the pre-combat phase, all their cards are on the table and they are susceptible to pretty much anything that can happen, barring freeze spells. But the relevance of casting this in combat phase is you can tap down your opponent's creatures, but also their soul ring, their arcane signet, and their treasure tokens, so that when the time comes for their post-combat main phase to start, they will have lost all of that mana because it's floating and it doesn't transfer over from phases. So they just lost a lot of mana that they might have been planning on using. Our most unloved card today is Sacred Boon, which sees play in 41 decks. This is a 2-mana instant that says, prevent up to 3 damage to target creature. At end of turn, put a +0/+1 counter on that creature for each 1 damage prevented in this way. Okay, this is actually pretty sick, especially because they got rid of +0/+1 counters, but if you have them on hand, that would be pretty awesome to pull out of your case and place it on your creature. So you have that unpopularity flex going on, especially because most people have probably never seen a physical +0/+1 counter before. But other than that, the immediate clout factor, this can be nice to instantly add a booty to any creature. It's more effective than squats and is guaranteed to see results by the end of turn. On the turn you cast this, your 3/3 can safely block a 5/5 creature. And at the end of turn, your creature will now be a 3/6. And this, add this in an Arcades deck to make your defenders bigger and have them assign damage equal to their toughness. Or maybe slot this in as a pet card in Atraxa to proliferate and see how many +0/+1 counters you can stack on a creature. Or let's say you swing with a Ragavan and the person accepts your trade and blocks with a 3/2 Tireless Provisioner. Ragavan will survive the encounter and kill the Tireless Provisioner, and at the end of the turn, Ragavan will now be 2/4 and not die to literally any weenie blocker out there. All right, that's all that I have for everyone today. Let me know what you thought of this video and if you enjoyed seeing these most unpopular of the unpopular cards. I'd also love to hear if there's any other topics or categories that you'd like me to cover in the future. As mentioned, I'll share some additional ones in Discord, but thanks everyone for being here. I really do appreciate each of you, and we'll see you next time.